One day, between the time he moved out of a cave and into a high-rise apartment, man invented the city. In the year 1000, there were about a dozen cities of 100,000 people. By 1800, 6 times that many. And the more cities man built, the more problems there were. Housing, transportation, congestion, pollution. In 1925, 1/4 of us lived in cities. Today, over half. By the year 2000, 2/3 of us will live in urban areas. Our cities will be twice the size they are today. We must build the equivalent of today's world on top of the one we already have. But it is not built yet. Now is the time to plan. This message brought to you by the United Nations Environment Program.
Stockholm, Sweden, June 12, 1972. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India, arrived today to address the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. She was met by the Secretary General of the conference, Mr. Maurice Strong.
We all know someone like Maurice Strong. They seem to go anywhere, get along with everyone, and do pretty much anything they put their minds to. But unlike anyone I've ever met, Maurice Strong's Rolodex was composed of world leaders, royal families, and a regular who's who in the top corporate and financial sectors all over the globe. In fact, if more people actually knew who Maurice Strong was, many would probably celebrate this small-statured and unassuming figure, who, by all accounts, held a much larger and more sustained impact on the world during his almost 40-year career than did any single American president who held office during that time. And while preventing population growth may have been the key focus of this 1972 conference, Maurice's interests were always more aligned with the resource management aspects of the many environmental efforts he would spearhead over the coming decades. Not the least interesting of which was his very own Manitow Foundation, a tax shelter, non-profit organization founded alongside his wife with help from their longtime friend and business associate Lawrence Rockefeller, through which Maurice spent decades and millions buying and developing crucial land on and surrounding public resources throughout North America. I encourage you to check this one out for yourself sometime, because it's totally not a cult of restorative justice activists trying to save the world from itself, while also using access to highly privileged information to make gigantic real estate deals all across the country. Anywho, Maurice is responsible for not only funding the research we'll be discussing, but also coordinating and directing every single event we'll be examining in this series. That being said, it's time we take some time and really get to know Maurice and the family Strong. Dr. Anna Louise Strong was a legendary feminist figure and prolific socialist writer who played a more than significant role in both major communist revolutions of the early 20th century. In fact, prior to her first move to China, where she lived the majority of her life, Anna Louise, or Anise for short, lived in the newly formed Soviet Union, where she had become close friends with both Lenin and Trotsky, and wrote several articles that later turned into books explaining their many triumphs and pitfalls to the outside world. She helped found and run the Moscow News, and later wrote a book on that time, which many critics regard as an attempted justification for Stalin. Though, for the record, she would later sharply criticize Stalinism during her efforts toward a new communism alongside longtime comrade Chairman Mao. It's difficult to imagine today exactly how impactful writers were during this time period, especially in regards to these two early communist countries who were notoriously careful about what information made it into their population, or for that matter, out to the world. For decades, not only did Anna Louise control the exclusive scoop on communism in the 20th century, but later in life, as an emissary and ambassador for a country that was effectively off limits to the entire world, she was also the main filter by which any news from the West would have to pass through in order to make it in. By hosting honored guests like Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1959, and then later the exiled head of the NAACP in 1963, her ambassadorship made headlines all over the world as the very selective guest list to such a closed atmosphere created some important insights as to the socio-political alignments of Beijing. Meanwhile, over on the other side of the globe, Maurice Strong was about to resign his presidency over the Power Corporation of Canada in order to pursue a path that would lead him towards becoming the world's leading authority on, well, the world. Maurice's family ties may have opened a lot of doors, but what he was actually able to accomplish with those opportunities is truly profound. Throughout his life, Strong held board membership on the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Stockholm Environmental Institute, the African American Institute, the Institute of Ecology in Indonesia, the Bayer Institute of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, Maurice would go on from UN Secretary General to founding director of UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, and become the longtime foundation director of the World Economic Forum, a senior advisor to the president of the World Bank, as well as sit on advisory councils of the Center for International Development of Harvard University, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the Huxley-founded World Wildlife Fund, as well as the World Conservation Union, IUCN, which we'll hear more about later. There is truly no doubt that the Strongs were a force of nature and dramatic change on this planet in the 20th century. When Anais died in 1970, just 2 years before this event happened and film was made, she was laid to rest in a place of high honor by Chairman Mao himself at the Revolutionary Cemetery in Beijing. Meanwhile, back on the other side of the globe, Maurice, who had referred to himself as a socialist in ideology, a capitalist in methodology, was first learning to communicate corporate interest in environmental terms, and throughout his life would do so better than anyone else who ever lived, while using this immense administrative power and influence to shape the world in which we now know today. Also, oddly enough, he too died in China, but he did so in late 2015 while seeking sanctuary from prosecution by the US government for charges of bribery. But that comes much later in the story.
For 11 days in June 1972, Stockholm was a magnet for everyone concerned with the environment. 1,200 official delegates from 113 nations were in Stockholm for the first international conference on the human environment. The meeting, first proposed to the United Nations by Sweden and approved by the General Assembly in 1968, attracted worldwide attention. In 4 short years, the topic of the human environment had gone from the back pages of newspapers to make headlines on page 1. The whole city of Stockholm was caught up in the conference. The conference symbol appeared everywhere, and the pre-conference publicity brought thousands of unofficial observers from all over the world to Stockholm. The government of Sweden provided facilities for all of them. At Skarpnäck, an abandoned airfield on the outskirts of town, it even set up a tent city for the many young people who could not pay for lodgings. Members of official delegations were supplied with new model Swedish cars. But this was a different kind of conference. The delegates were also offered the use of 200 bicycles, ecologically a more apt means of transportation. On the 5th of June, the delegates came together in the huge meeting hall of the Folkets Hus for the first plenary session of the official conference.
I declare open the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment.
The preparatory committee had chosen 6 major areas of deliberation: human settlements, resource management, identification and control of international pollutants, development and the environment, education and information, and future organizational needs. As the first order of business, the delegates elected a president by acclamation. They chose the head of the Swedish delegation to the conference, Mr. Ingemund Bengtsson.
The attention of the world is now directed at us in Stockholm. Let us therefore fulfill the justified expectations of the peoples of the world that this conference will lay a lasting foundation for the continuing efforts which we must undertake to ensure a better quality of life for all.
The eyes and ears of the world were indeed trained on Stockholm. Radio and television reports from the conference reached millions around the world. The official meetings were held in 3 separate conference buildings, but Swedish radio and television also carried the scores of non-official events happening all over the city. But the theme of the conference, Only One Earth, was seriously compromised by a technical question. Because East Germany was not yet a member of any United Nations body, it was invited to be present without the right to vote, while West Germany, a member of the World Health Organization, was given a regular seat. Because of this, the Soviet Union and most Eastern European countries stayed away from Stockholm.
The very fact that the conference began with 113 participating countries with very high-level delegations from those countries, this in itself represented a very significant step forward, because this demonstrated more than anything else the real concern of the majority of countries in the world. And those countries which did not participate in the conference did not remain away because they were disinterested in the issue. They remained away because of another political issue that didn't have any direct relevance to environment. So those who were here because they were interested. Those who were not here because they weren't interested in the environment issue.
What Maurice is so eloquently trying to explain is that while communist governments were not permitted to and/or refused to participate in the formal UN body, environmental causes could be a new common ground to achieve a more unified one-world vision. It's important to understand the complexity of this matter, so please follow me down the rabbit hole that is historical context. The Soviet Union wasn't always as resistant to scientific and social cooperation with foreign governments. But under Stalin, their original philosophy of economic embargo to cut off capitalist influence evolved into a policy of zero cooperation, which then cemented itself after a man named Lysenko declared the medical, academic, and education systems, which were recently being established all over the world, to be a new tool of the oppressor, and from his point of view, evidence was overwhelming. While devastatingly wrong about so many of his conclusions, this entirely valid criticism established Lysenko as a champion of those who would oppose the elitist establishment with every fabric of their being. Lysenko's justifiably dissenting voice resonated with not only the proletariat, but also gained him favor with Stalin himself. Indeed, with most intellectuals and people of means and education, there existed and still exists a caretaker outlook, or poor fool fallacy, in which the population as a whole is treated as takers who need to be provided for and watched over by the more enlightened and thereby self-appointed caretakers. Many socialists, as well as other philosophers, have framed this self-appointed guardianship position as a mechanism of control used by the oppressor to wield authority over the oppressed, and thereby refuse to participate or engage in any of their bourgeois institutions, or recognize any authority they have granted themselves. While understandable as I find the socialist mindset to be in this regard, it's always very interesting that power structures have never actually dissolved upon revolution. Instead, they are just repossessed and redirected under state control. And as a testament of this, while Lysenko may have gained his popularity by making valid criticisms of the rising establishment and ruling classes of society, he then went on to rule over that same society for years as the singular scientific authority during Stalin's reign. And after officially severing ties between the Soviet Union and the one-world scientific establishment, he used his new and tremendous authority towards devastating ends. Even after the fall of Stalin and collapse of the Lysenkoist institutional outlook, the Soviet Union still decided not to participate in any of the pageantry or respect the self-appointed authority of the many institutional control mechanisms being constructed by their humanist counterparts at the UN. Unlike the US, the Soviets would never have imagined allowing foreign nations any level of control or access to their policies, whereas the US was happy to provide authority and assistance to the world governing agencies, just as long as Americans remained in the top offices. So instead of votes or seats at a formal council, a forum was provided by Strong and the other organizers of the conference to host a series of discussions, lectures, and struggle sessions examining this new and terrible environmental threat through a pretty recognizable philosophical lens. And instead of inferring political leanings or even explaining any more, I'll just let you listen and tell me if any of these arguments from 1972 sound familiar to you today.
Well, the Environment Forum is an unstructured conference, which makes it different from the United Nations conference in that people can get together and contribute what they want to contribute. And in order to enable them to contribute, there have been the workshops set up so that people who are interested in a particular subject can get together and discuss these subjects. A manifesto was brought together by a meeting of workshop leaders and was sent to Lady Barbara Ward Jackson, and its ideas incorporated in a further document which is being presented to the United Nations, a non-government organization document which is longer than this and is being presented to the United Nations today.
I'd have to pay the debt, and people are scrambling to see that the other fellow pays. So we're beginning to divide up, and I think we begin to see industry, labor, and consumers beginning to take very sharp sides on these issues. It's become, I think, a very basic and quite dangerous political issue because it leads very quickly to fundamental concerns that we've tended to push under the rug. The question of the validity of the private enterprise system, for example. The question of whether we can tolerate wars. Questions of racial discrimination. These are things that we tend to avoid talking about, but the environmental issue sort of casts a bright light on them, making them very difficult to avoid.
Before I begin my summary, there's an important message I'd like to drive home. So often, people overlook that there are multiple interests at play in every situation. This can easily lead to misunderstanding of results because so much of civilized existence is compromised. However, I'd also like to point out that what we are listening to is not that at all. This, my friends and fellow travelers, is called subversion. Problem A, in this case the environment, is being casually added to a long list of a lot of other giant issues. So now, instead of focusing on solutions to your problem, problem A, the environment, focus is now shifted to some long list by a person who most often very sincerely believes there is only one solution to every problem plaguing mankind, which to them morally justifies their subversion of your issues because they honestly and truly believe that your problem will be fixed by their one-size-fits-all solution, which is ultimately to end colonization and redistribute wealth and resources. But wait, why colonization and not capitalism this time? Well, theories evolve, and as studies of semantics progressed, it was discovered that by pivoting focus from capitalism to colonization, one could appeal to a much wider range of audience than with the old communist message framed as specifically anti-capitalist, which evidently was found lacking in appeal to those living in the highly economically mobile societies existing at the time, or, at the very least, had been sold on a dream of great wealth and personal achievement as an individual. With one simple word replacement, you need not be a communist in order to participate in the ongoing crusade of socialism versus individualism. It's genius, really. Pay attention to his specific terminology and how he attempts to use it to reframe the primary focal point of this particular conference as checkmate in his textbook argument for redistribution of wealth and resources.
The developing countries begin to realize that they have been victimized ecologically, so to speak, by colonization. That the population explosion is in effect the last remnants of the harmful influence of colonization on the colonies. And the proposition, which I believe will come up at the official conference here, for ecological reparations, I think is a just idea, which the developing countries are putting forward, and which I think reflects very clearly their proper understanding of the ecological base of their difficulties.
Just to amplify a little bit, the flush toilet, to take a homely example, is not political. When I, or a commissar in Moscow, or a capitalist in Tokyo, or a religious leader in India, flush our body wastes down into the public water supply, we are all equally guilty of stream pollution, regardless of the form of political organization we happen to live under.
Many argue that every issue is political. However, if you take away one thing from this entire episode, I hope it's that while every idea is conceived by a person and translated through their multiple theoretical frameworks and ideological lenses throughout their life, the source of that idea is not bound by the politics of our perception. Truth just is. And if the math doesn't add up, the rocket simply will not fly. Much like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, we all examine pieces and understand different aspects of the greater truth from our own perspectives, and ultimately, we are all just guessing within the range of our own knowledge and experience. However, regardless of how you explain it, or reasoning you give to justify its existence, I think it's very important to remember that there is, in fact, an elephant in the room. We'll talk about this and much more in our next episode, but suffice to say, Maurice didn't mind if your focus was on population control or the redistribution of wealth and resources. And in fact, throughout his extensive career in politics, philanthropy, and resource management, he often championed both causes with equal enthusiasm and was even appointed to run Petro-Canada during its nationalization process by the then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Maurice will go on from here to fund research and assemble the institutional infrastructure needed to prepare the world for the next 20-year phase of this multi-generational plan. Stockholm was truly a landmark in human history, because not only did the UN gain its first official global authority on matters of the environment, but the event itself created a unification of purpose for mankind, to save the Earth from us. To go from believing humanity was above all other life on this planet, to now training younger generations to see themselves as a plague that might one day destroy it. This has had a tremendous psychological impact on our species as a whole. Now, it's important to state, I'm not arguing against any position held by any environmentally based movement. More so, I am pointing out the undeniable, but almost never mentioned mentality shift and tremendous impact it has had on the psychological well-being of the modern human society. This impact still echoes throughout views on family size, lessened priority and perceived impracticality of breeding, along with how we view each other and ourselves on a world scale. Which, of course, we'll hear more about later. But as we conclude this episode, let's listen to Maurice give us his final thoughts as we say goodbye to the Stockholm World Conference on the Human Environment.
I think the lasting message of the Stockholm Conference will be the realization that man has come to one of those seminal points in his history where his own activities are the principal determinants of his own future, and where he realizes that he has got to subject those activities to a much more responsible management and control than he has in the past. And this has tremendous implications, not only for his relationship with the natural systems on which his life depends, but more particularly for his relations with his fellow man on this planet. And I think the awareness of this and the beginning of a program of international action to deal with this will be one of the most durable effects of the Stockholm Conference.
A few days later, the visitors were gone, and the city was back to normal. But for many people, Stockholm will always be connected with the first international attempt to do something about environmental problems.
biological and practical research. What he's giving us now is his experience, and that's going to form a basis for our experiments and our research. And so the next generation will take what we've given them as basis and then carry on like this every generation, because there are different needs.